Welcome back to this next video in which we are studying headaches. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing a little bit of background anatomy so that we can then move on to discussing the pathophysiology of migraine headaches. And the background anatomy that we've been going over is the anatomy of the meninges. What I want to do now is have a look at the anatomy of the innervation of the meninges. I've told you that the meninges are going to be innervated by nociceptors, and they're the main intracranial site of nociceptors because the actual brain parenchyma isn't actually innervated by nociceptors. And migraine headaches are going to originate from the activation of these meningeal nociceptors, which is why we want to study them. So we want to have a look at the nerves which actually provide these primary nociceptive afferents to the meninges. Now, before we actually do just move on to discussing the innervation of the meninges, allow me to make one more comment about the meninges themselves. So, when I was telling you about the pia mater originally, I said that this layer is often left on in anatomical specimens of the brain because it's incredibly well adhered to the surface of the brain, and it's very thin, so you can actually usually see through it, and you'll be able to see the brain tissue underneath. So you might, when you're looking at one of these specimens, not even realise that the pia mater is actually still on there, but usually it will be. What I now want to stress is that the other two layers, the outer layers, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, which are really attached to the bone rather than the actual central nervous system, and remember there's the cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, those layers are not usually left on brain specimens. So when looking at a brain specimen, you won't usually see the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. You might see little fragments of it that have stayed attached, but if it was there in full, you wouldn't be able to see the central nervous system underneath, because those layers are much thicker and they're not translucent in the way that the pia mater is. So normally on brain specimens, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater are not there, but the pia mater is usually there. Okay, so there's my final comment on the meninges done. Let's now talk about the innervation of the meninges. So, where are the branches that are going to innervate the meninges going to come off? Well, they're going to come off the same nerves that we've already discussed previously for innervation of the peripheral extracranial tissues of the head and neck region. They're going to come off the three divisions of the trigeminal nerves, the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve, and also the mixed cervical spinal nerves, C1, C2, and C3. So let's discuss this. Alright, so we're going to start off by discussing branches that come off the ophthalmic nerve, then we'll discuss branches that come off the maxillary nerves, and then we'll discuss the branches that come off the mandibular nerves. So, I've brought you back up here to my picture of the trigeminal nerve here. So remember, the trigeminal nerve comes off the front of the pons, you then have the trigeminal ganglion in this position, and then off the trigeminal ganglion comes the three divisions of the trigeminal nerve, the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve, and we've discussed their anatomy previously. Just to add a little point here, now that we've discussed the meninges, and to tell you where actually are these nerves in terms of the meninges, whenever something comes off the surface of the brain, like a cranial nerve, such as the trigeminal nerve, it's going to penetrate through the pia mater. So the pia mater will be over the surface of the pons, and when the trigeminal nerve comes off, it will break through the pia mater. So it will then be in the subarachnoid space in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. So that's where the trigeminal nerve originally will be, in that subarachnoid space. And lots of things are in the subarachnoid space. Lots of things that you think of as being outside of the brain, such as, for instance, a lot of the cerebral arteries that supply the brain with blood, they're going to be outside of the pia mater, but inside of the arachnoid mater, so they'll be in that subarachnoid space full of cerebrospinal fluid. So the trigeminal nerve will originally be in that subarachnoid space, surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, and then as it comes forward, the ophthalmic nerve and the maxillary nerve, they're actually going to run in the wall of the outer layers of the meninges. Specifically, they'll run within the arachnoid mater and the meningeal dura mater. So remember, in this position, we have said that there is the cavernous sinuses, and those are sinuses in between the periosteal dura mater and the meningeal dura mater. So on top of the cavernous sinuses, in between the cavernous sinus and the subarachnoid space, you have the meningeal dura mater, and then you have the arachnoid mater. So if you're in the subarachnoid space, standing on top of the cavernous sinus, to get into the cavernous sinus, you'd have to drill through the arachnoid mater, you'd then have to drill through the meningeal dura mater, you'd then be in the cavernous sinus. If you drilled through the cavernous sinus, you'd then have to drill through the periosteal dura mater, which would be the bottom wall of the cavernous sinus, and then you'd hit bone finally. So, these nerves, the ophthalmic nerve and the maxillary nerve, you can see that they're very close to where we said the cavernous sinus is. They run in the walls of the cavernous sinus, so they're going to join the walls of the cavernous sinus, and that's the interior wall of the cavernous sinus. So it's the wall made up of the meningeal dura mater and the arachnoid mater. So I hope that's clear that they're going to run in those walls. And then when they go through these holes, when they go through, for instance, the superior orbital fissure in terms of, well, for the ophthalmic nerves, they will then break through those outer layers of meninges. They'll break through the arachnoid mater, they'll break through the meningeal dura mater, they'll break through the periosteal dura mater to go through the hole and leave the cranial cavity. And the same for the maxillary nerve down here when it goes through the foramen rotundum. So that's just a little additional bit of anatomy to put everything in context, that these nerves are running in that wall of the cavernous sinus, the internal wall of the cavernous sinus. Okay, so all of the three branches of the trigeminal nerve actually give off branches that I haven't told you about previously. We went over the basic branches of the trigeminal nerve previously. There are a few smaller branches that they give off that are going to innervate the meninges and are going to carry the peripheral processes of the primary nociceptive afferents that are going to innervate the meninges. And I now want to study these, then we'll come on to the branches that are going to come from the posterior rami of the cervical spinal nerves, C1, C2, and C3. Right, so let's begin then with the ophthalmic nerve. What branches does the ophthalmic nerve give off that are going to innervate the meninges? Well, it actually gives off a branch before it enters the superior orbital fissure, and I think I'll try and put this on this picture here. So in green here, this is a branch that it gives off, and this branch goes backwards, like so, from the ophthalmic nerve. So in green then, I think I've got a very thin oh no, is the thickness I want. It's just not showing up brilliantly there. I might just go over that in a thicker pen so that it shows up better. So in green here, there's a branch from the ophthalmic nerve running backwards. Now let me just tell you the anatomy of where this is actually running. Remember, I have just said that the ophthalmic nerve is in the internal wall of the cavernous sinus. It's running within the arachnoid mater and the meningeal dura mater. When it gives off this branch remains running in the outer meninges. So it's going to remain in those outer meninges, the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. So it comes back, and remember, all of the inside of the cranial cavity is lined by the outer meninges, the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. So it can continue running in this way. And now when it crosses the petrous portion of the temporal bone, it's then going to go on top of the tentorium cerebelli. So remember, all of this space, there is the tentorium cerebelli that divides the posterior cranial fossa into a superior portion and an inferior portion, and the inferior portion is, of course, where the cerebellum is. It's going to run on top of that. And remember, that tentorium cerebelli, that consists of a fold of meningeal dura mater, and then on top of that fold of meningeal dura mater, you'll then have the arachnoid mater. So it will be running in the tentorium cerebelli, and it continues on backwards, so it doesn't just stop here. It goes further backwards, right to the back of the posterior cranial fossa here, and it's on top of the tentorium cerebelli, or it's running in the superior part of the tentorium cerebelli. So remember, the tentorium cerebelli is a fold, so it'll have two layers of meningeal dura mater folded back on one another, and then over the top of that, two layers of arachnoid mater. So overall, it'll have four layers if you wanted to chisel through it. So if we started at the top and wanted to chisel through the tentorium cerebelli, we'd start by going through an arachnoid mater layer, we'd then go through a meningeal dura mater layer, we'd go for another meningeal dura mater layer, and on the bottom we'd go for another arachnoid mater layer, and then we'd chisel out and we'd be back in the subarachnoid space, but now in the inferior aspect of the posterior cranial fossa. So this nerve is running in the top layers, the top layer of arachnoid mater and the top layer of meningeal dura mater, and then as it comes to the back, it's going to then fold upwards and go into the occipital portion, and it's difficult to to show this, so I'll go over onto this picture. It'll go up and run in the occipital outer meninges. So, of course, this back portion of the skull will be internally lined by dura mater and arachnoid mater as well. It can just continue up in that and then go backwards. So it's also going to innervate not just the tentorium cerebelli, and in fact I haven't said that yet, but that's indeed what it's going to innervate. It's going to give lots of branches to the tentorium cerebelli, but it's also going to innervate the occipital meninges, the meninges at the back of the brain, in the occipital areas. So I suppose I should tell you what the name of this branch from the ophthalmic nerve actually is. This is called the recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve. So let me write this here. So that branch that we've coloured in green here, because it's going backwards, we call it the recurrent branch, because it's going in the opposite direction to the rest of the ophthalmic nerve. So this is the recurrent, and it's going to the meninges, so we'll call it a meningeal branch. So it's the recurrent meningeal branch, and then it's of the ophthalmic nerve, which is V1, so we'll just put V1 there, or the first division of the trigeminal nerve. So, what am I therefore telling you? This is quite interesting, and this is actually much more interesting than you might realise. I am telling you that from the ophthalmic nerve comes the branch that innervates the tentorium cerebelli with nociceptive afferents, and also all of the occipital portions of the meninges. Now, headaches usually arise in the occipital region of the brain. That's why the visual cortex is usually affected, if it's going to be affected, by an aura. So we often believe that migraines do originate in the occipital portion of the brain, especially when they are accompanied by a visual aura. And that's going to activate, therefore, the meninge, the meningeal nociceptors in that occipital region, which is carried, therefore, by the ophthalmic nerve. Where do you usually feel the pain of migraine? You usually feel it in the forehead, the periorbital region, and the temporal region. The forehead, the frontal region, and the periorbital region, they are the peripheral sites that the ophthalmic nerve innervates with nociceptors. So it looks as though the pain from the occipital meninges is going to be referred to the site where the ophthalmic nerve is more used to collecting pain from. And indeed, referred pain is a very important concept when we're talking about meningeal nociceptors, and I'll come back to that later. So it is significant that the back of the brain, the occipital region of the cerebral hemispheres, the meninges lining those, are going to be innervated by this recurrent branch from the ophthalmic nerve. And indeed, also the tentorium cerebelli is innervated with nociceptors from that recurrent branch of the ophthalmic nerve. Okay, so there's a branch coming off the ophthalmic nerve, the recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve, a very important nerve that moves back in the meninges, and which is going to be carrying lots of peripheral processes of primary nociceptive afferents that will have their cell bodies in the trigeminal ganglion and will send their central processes into the trigeminocervical complex on the ipsilateral side. Remember, the trigeminocervical complex is the collection of all second-order neurons in the trigeminal nuclei and the substantia gelatinosa of the C1 and C2 spinal levels that are going to have primary nociceptive afferents from the head and neck region synapsing onto them. And these are most definitely primary nociceptive afferents from the head and neck region. They're coming in the trigeminal nerve, and they're going to go, their central processes will go into the trigeminal sensory nucleus. And we'll come back to discussing the concept of referred pain later on, once we've seen the full story of branches that innervate the meninges. But know that that branch innervates the tentorium cerebelli with nociceptive afferents, and also the occipital meninges with nociceptive afferents. So the meninges in this sort of region here are all going to be innervated by this recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve that is running in the outer meninges, note. Okay, but it also will give branches that will go through the subarachnoid space and will innervate other meningeal, more inner portions of the meningeal tissues as well. Right, so that's the recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve. There is another branch from the ophthalmic nerve that innervates the meninges, an anterior meningeal branch from a branch that we haven't discussed yet of the ophthalmic nerve called the anterior ethmoidal nerve. So I need to tell you a bit more about the ophthalmic nerve now. So back up to this picture over here. So here we have the ophthalmic nerve coming through the superior orbital fissure and entering the orbit, and it's now outside of the cranial cavity, so we can abandon talk of the meninges now. It's penetrated through the meninges, and those are over now. So, here it's going to split into three major branches: the lacrimal nerve that goes off to the lacrimal gland and also innervates surrounding tissues up there, such as the superior eyelid; the frontal nerve that splits into the supratrochlear and the supraorbital nerve. Oh, sorry, got them the wrong way around. Supratrochlear is this one, supraorbital is this one. The supratrochlear and supraorbital nerves, which go up onto the forehead and innervate the forehead skin and muscle tissue there. And then the nasociliary nerve here that gives branches into the ciliary ganglion, which then gives off the short ciliary nerves and also gives off the long ciliary nerve that penetrates the sclera. And those are going to be sensory fibres going into the eyeball. This then continues on, and the branch that I told you about that comes off this nasociliary nerve is then the infratrochlear nerve, which innervates the bottom eyelid and the bottom structures of the eye region. However, the nasociliary nerve also has another very important branch that I didn't feel necessary to tell you when I was giving you this introductory anatomy of the ophthalmic nerve, which now is going to be important. So at this sort of stage here, there is another branch coming off there, and this branch is called the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and this branch is going to enter a hole in the medial wall of the orbital cavity called the anterior ethmoidal foramen, and it's going to move up in that bone of the medial wall of the orbital cavity up actually into the anterior cranial fossa, and I'll show you where it comes out in just a moment. So let's firstly write down the name of this nerve. So this is the anterior, which I'll just abbreviate down to ant, and then it's the ethmoidal because it's going to be moving through the ethmoidal bone. Remember, this is another bone of the skull that's right in the centre between the two eyes. So, the anterior ethmoidal, and then it's a nerve, so I'll just abbreviate that to N. So this branch here, another branch of the nasociliary nerve, is the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and it is an important branch, it's a big branch. So it's going to now go through a foramen called the anterior ethmoidal foramen, which is in the medial wall of the orbital cavity, and this takes it into a little tube that goes upwards. So it goes up in that medial wall of the orbital cavity, and where does it come out? In the anterior cranial fossa. Remember, here's the orbital cavity. It's now gone in here, and it's going upwards, so it's going to come out here. So we need to have a look a little bit more closely at the anatomy of the anterior cranial fossa, because I've previously been drawing it extremely boringly. I've shown you the anterior cranial fossa here, and it's just plain. However, there is a structure, a notable structure here that you very easily will spot if you have a model skull. If you look at the skull, there's a structure here, and that structure is two grooves with a ridge of bone in between them. So let me just try and draw this in. These are, of course, the olfactory grooves with the crista galli in between them. Okay, and of course, these are where the olfactory bulbs are going to be, and where cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve, which is actually the name for the nerves that actually innervate the nasal mucosa, the olfactory mucosa beneath the cribriform plate, are going to come through. Okay, so what I'm drawing here then, so those are the two grooves, so I'll just put their names here. So these are very, very prominent. These are not minor little structures. If you look at the anterior cranial fossa, you will see these little grooves there. And those grooves on either side are called the olfactory groove, and they're grooves rather. And they're very, very important as far as sense of smell is concerned, because underneath these, the floor of these olfactory grooves, is something called the cribriform plate. So the floor is made up by the cribriform plate. And this cribriform plate has loads of little tubes through it. And underneath the cribriform plate is, of course, the top of the nasal cavity. So if I had a chisel, again, I love giving these analogies with chiseling. If I chiseled through the cribriform plate, I would end up in the nasal cavity. Of course, we've got the left cribriform plate and the right cribriform plate. If I chiseled through the right cribriform plate, I'd end up in the right nasal cavity. And that top portion of the nasal cavity is lined by a very special portion of mucosa, specifically the olfactory epithelium. So not all of the lining of the nasal cavities is actually capable of sensing smell. Most of it is just a boring old epithelium that plays its part in catching dirt particles that are coming in the air we're breathing in, and warming the air up and things like that, and humidifying the air, but it's not part of the sense of smell apparatus. However, the portion of the lining of the nasal cavity that's right at the top of the nasal cavity, underneath the cribriform plate here, is the olfactory epithelium that actually has the cells that are responsible for your sense of smell. And those, of course, will be linked to nerve cells that are going to take the messages into the central nervous system. And those nerve cells send their axons through the cribriform plate up into these olfactory grooves, and in the olfactory grooves will be structures called the olfactory bulbs, where they will synapse onto second-order neurons. And those first neurons that carry the sense of smell, they are actually what we mean by cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. So the cribriform plate has the olfactory nerves coming through it. Okay, right. However, we're not interested in cranial nerve number 1. We're interested in where the anterior ethmoidal nerve is going to come out, and it actually comes out in the sides of these olfactory grooves. I was just giving you a little bit of background there. Now, another important structure that's in between the two olfactory grooves, and which I'll put in here, is a ridge of bone. So in between the two olfactory grooves, separating the two of them, is a ridge of bone, and people expect you to know the name of that ridge of bone. That's called the crista galli. So this is the background anatomy. So, in the anterior cranial fossa at the front, you have these structures that I've just told you about, the olfactory grooves on either side, separated by this crista galli in between. And the floor of the olfactory grooves is made up by the cribriform plates. Now, in the middle of the olfactory grooves and on their lateral sides, this is where the anterior ethmoidal foramen is going to empty out, and the anterior ethmoidal nerve that has come up from the orbital cavity will come out in the olfactory groove. So I might try and show this at risk of destroying the picture though. Okay, so here in yellow, here is the anterior ethmoidal nerve on either side. Of course, you have a left and a right one, coming out in the middle of the olfactory grooves. What are they going to do now? Well, what does the anterior ethmoidal nerve actually supply with sensory innervation? It actually supplies the nasal epithelium with sensory innervation, not olfactory innervation. It's not to do with the olfactory epithelium. I've just discussed the olfactory epithelium. Those have the special olfactory nerves that come up through the cribriform plate to the olfactory bulbs that are in the olfactory grooves. However, the epithelium of the nasal cavity has other forms of sensory innervation, the general sensory innervation, such as nociceptive innervation, and these are being carried by the anterior ethmoidal nerves. So these are now going to go down into the nasal cavities. Now that they've got up into these olfactory grooves from the orbital cavities, most of the anterior ethmoidal nerves now go down into the nasal cavities. How do they get into them? Well, right at the front of the olfactory grooves, and these are often left out of plastic models of the brain because they're very small. But if you have a real brain, plastic models of the skull, I should say, not brain. If you've got a real skull, you will see these tiny little slits that are called nasal slits, and those are right at the front of the olfactory grooves. So, right at the front of the olfactory grooves, we have two little slits in the cribriform plate, and right at the front there are holes, big holes in the cribriform plate. Most of the holes in the cribriform plate are absolutely tiny and you can't see them, but they're there, and they're the holes that the olfactory nerves come up through. But right at the front of the olfactory grooves, and I'm not going to attempt to show it on here, there are little slits which are big holes going down now into the nasal cavity, and these are the slits through which the anterior ethmoidal nerves are going to go through. So they move forwards in the olfactory grooves to the nasal slits at the front, and then they go down to the nasal cavities, and then they'll innervate with sensory innervation the nasal cavities. Now, just to make, again, things clear in terms of the meninges, of course, all of this will be lined by the outer meninges, the dura mater, both layers, and the arachnoid mater. These nerves will be running in those meninges. They will be running in those outer meninges. They will not penetrate through them and go into the subarachnoid space. They're just running through the outer meninges that line all of the bone and are attached to the bone. So when it comes up through the anterior ethmoidal foramen here, where it empties out. It'll temporarily run through those outer meninges, and then it will go into the nasal slit and down into the nasal cavity. Now you might be thinking at this point, well, why on earth has he told us all of this? I'm not interested in innervation of the nasal cavity. Yes, I've learned a little bit more about the anatomy of the ophthalmic nerve, but we were talking about meningeal innervation. So why was this necessary? Because, of course, these nerves are now in the perfect position to give off a branch that is going to innervate the anterior frontal portions of the meninges, and indeed they do. So both of the anterior ethmoidal nerves, again I'll do this in green, are going to give off meningeal branches that I'm putting here, which are going to run forward and then they will reflect over. So remember, the skull's going to come up here, so they'll go to the edge and then they'll come up, and they're going to therefore be innervating the orbitofrontal, which are the meninges facing down to the orbital cavities, and then the frontal portion here. So again, the ophthalmic nerve finds itself innervating a huge amount of very important meninges. Not just did it do the occipital portions and the tentorium cerebelli, but now it's doing the frontal portions. And actually it has a very big territory because the frontal portions connect up with the occipital regions behind. So if I wanted to sort of show you the territory of meninges that is innervated by branches of the ophthalmic nerve, it is very, very vast. It's all of this anterior frontal bit here, but then it extends backwards, and it's also the occipital region and the tentorium cerebelli here. So the two domains from the two different branches, the recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve and these anterior meningeal branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerves, they link up in the middle here, basically. So overall, the ophthalmic nerve has a massive domain of meninges that it innervates, and the only meninges that we still need to see where they're innervated by are these bits that are lateral, and also these bits at the bottom, the bits that coat the cerebellum and the brainstem in the inferior part of the posterior cranial fossa underneath the tentorium cerebelli. So I haven't quite written down the names of these branches coming off the anterior ethmoidal nerves, so let me now write those down. So these are the anterior, which I'll abbreviate down to ANT again, meningeal, because of course they're innervating the meninges, and they're branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerves, so of the anterior ethmoidal nerves. So we've got two anterior meningeal branches of the two anterior ethmoidal nerves. So ends, I'll just put there. Okay, anterior meningeal branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerves, and they innervate the frontal portions of the meninges. And again, let me stress that they are running in the outer layers of the meninges. The dura mater and the arachnoid mater is where they will be running, the layers that are surrounding the skull. They're not running in the pia mater. That's, remember, the very inner layer. You'd have to go through the subarachnoid space, all of that CSF, and then you'd get to the pia mater. Some of the branches, of course, from these nerves will penetrate through the subarachnoid space and innervate more internal structures of the meninges, but the actual major nerves are running in the outer meninges, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. Okay, so those are the anterior meningeal branches of the anterior ethmoidal nerves. So that now is the ophthalmic nerve's contribution to the innervation of the meninges complete. We're now going to talk about the maxillary nerve and then the mandibular nerve. These give off much smaller branches, and these are going to deal with the lateral meninges. So we've discussed that the ophthalmic nerve's territory is the, whoops, give me the laser pointer, the orbitofrontal meninges, the frontal meninges, then it goes all the way back to the occipital meninges and the tentorium cerebelli. But what about these lateral portions of the meninges here? Those are going to be dealt with by the branches from the maxillary nerves and the mandibular nerves. So let's start off with the maxillary nerves. Now this is very, very simple. I've told you about how the maxillary nerves, they run in the internal wall of the cavernous sinuses on either side, just like the ophthalmic nerve was running in the internal wall of the cavernous sinus. So it's within the meningeal dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and then when it gets to the foramen rotundum, it will penetrate through the arachnoid mater, through the meningeal dura mater, through the periosteal dura mater, and then it will go for its bony hole, the foramen rotundum. Now, before it does that, it's going to give off a branch that's going to remain within the meninges, going to continue running in those outer meninges, and that's going to be called the middle meningeal nerve. So here it comes, and it comes off in this sort of position here and goes lateral and is going to be giving off nociceptive fibers to the meninges in this anterior lateral portion of the middle cranial fossa. So let me write down the name of this one, and we're running out of space very quickly. Let me try and squeeze it in here. So this is the middle meningeal nerve that we're seeing here, and of course you have two. You have a left middle meningeal nerve and a right middle meningeal nerve, and they come off the maxillary nerves before they penetrate through all of the layers of the outer meninges to go through the foramen rotundums. Okay, and that, as I say, will continue running in the outer meninges, and it goes to the side of the middle cranial fossa here, and then of course it will go up the side of the skull as well. It was on the floor of the middle cranial fossa, now it will be on the lateral wall of the middle cranial fossa, and the territory that it's therefore going to innervate, it will innervate the meninges in this sort of region, this floor region, and also those meninges in the lateral wall of the middle cranial fossa in the anterior portion. So this sort of realm, this is the realm of the maxillary branches to the meninges. So I'll show it on this picture. It's this sort of region here. So just to keep it all ticking over, the ophthalmic nerve does the orbitofrontal and the frontal, and it extends right back into the occipital and the tentorium cerebelli here. We at the moment are discussing lateral meninges here, and the anterior portion of the lateral meninges is dealt with by the middle meningeal nerves from the maxillary nerves. Right. Onwards, so now finally the branch that comes off the mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve, remember, it's going to go through the foramen ovale. Again, to go through the foramen ovale, it's going to have to penetrate through the arachnoid mater, through the meningeal dura mater, through the periosteal dura mater, and then it will be able to go through its bony hole, the foramen ovale. Okay? Now, it goes out of the foramen ovale and, of course, ends up in the infratemporal fossa. Where's my picture of it here? So here we have it, back to this extremely complicated picture. Here it is coming out of the foramen ovale and ending up in the infratemporal fossa here. And we've discussed all of its major branches here. However, there is another minor branch that I didn't tell you about previously, which is one of the first branches to come off. So it would come off in this position, and this is the branch that's going to go back into the cranial cavity. So this is a recurrent branch, effectively, as well, because the mandibular nerve has now come out of the middle cranial fossa. It's in the infratemporal fossa. It then gives off its branch, which then goes through another hole and re-enters the cranial cavity. So you might have been expecting me to just say, oh, and there's a branch that comes off the mandibular nerve before it leaves the foramen ovale, but it's more complicated in the case of the mandibular nerve. So let's just put this on here. So here it comes, this little yellow branch that I've put in there, and I'll get my laser pointer in case you missed me putting it on. That little branch that I've just added in there, and that is called the nervus spinosus, and its name actually gives you a clue as to what foramen it's going to go through. It's going to go through the foramen spinosum. So, have I still got my picture of the fossae? No, I haven't. I think somehow it managed to erase that. But previously I showed you the different cranial, the different foramina in the floors of the cranial fossae. So remember, we have foramen rotundum, through which the maxillary nerve went through. We had the foramen ovale, and remember, lateral to the foramen ovale, there's a tiny little foramen called the foramen spinosum, and that is the foramen through which the nervus spinosus is going to come through. So nervus spinosus is going to come through a little foramen that's lateral and backwards from the foramen ovale that's called the foramen spinosum. And on our big picture here, it's in the perfect position. Where I've drawn it is very nicely positioned. Here is the foramen ovale in this sort of position, and I might even be brave enough to try and put it on here. Again, in a little pinky colour, there's a little foramen there, and that is called the foramen spinosum. And when the nervus spinosus goes through that, it will return back into the middle cranial fossa. And of course, it's now going to be faced with the outer meninges. If it wanted to get back into the middle cranial fossa properly, it would have to go through the periosteal dura mater. It would have to go through the meningeal dura mater, through the arachnoid mater. It would then be in the subarachnoid space. However, it doesn't want to do that because it's going to innervate the meninges. So it's going to go in and stay in those outer layers of the meninges, and it will run in those outer layers of the meninges, and it's going to innervate with nociceptive innervation, those outer layers of the meninges. So putting this on then, here comes the nervus spinosus, and it will come in this sort of position here. So coming back in through the foramen spinosum, and I might just try and put some of these foramina back on. So there in pink, that's representing the foramen spinosum. That one, of course, is the foramen ovale. I might even just put rotundum on as well there. Yes, so there we go. So through the foramen spinosum comes the nervus spinosus, this branch from the mandibular nerve, and then it will stay in those outer layers of the meninges, and it will run to the side of the middle cranial fossa, giving branches off, of course, to this posterior floor of the middle cranial fossa. Then it will run up the lateral walls of the middle cranial fossa, and again it will give off branches that innervate those lateral walls of the middle cranial fossa. And that overall means that now the posterior portion of the middle cranial fossa, both the floor of the posterior portion of the middle cranial fossa and the lateral wall of the posterior part of the middle cranial fossa, this region, all of the meninges in that region, they're innervated by a branch from the mandibular nerve on either side. So, we've now done the innervation of the meninges that surround the cerebral hemispheres, and again I'll just recite it back off to you. The ophthalmic nerve covers the biggest amount of territory because it has two separate branches, the recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve and the anterior meningeal branches from the anterior ethmoidal nerves. And this overall means that its territory of meningeal innervation is the orbitofrontal meninges, the frontal meninges, and then its frontal territory meets its posterior territory, its occipital territory. So from the recurrent meningeal branch of the ophthalmic nerve, we innervate the occipital meninges and also the tentorium cerebelli. Then the lateral portion here, which is the middle cranial fossa portion, the anterior portion of the middle cranial fossa, this region is dealt with by the middle meningeal nerve from the maxillary nerve, and the posterior portion of the middle cranial fossa, this region here, that is dealt with by the nervus spinosus, which is a branch of the mandibular nerves. Right, so there's only one thing that remains to be answered, which is the meninges of the inferior part of the posterior cranial fossa. Where does their innervation come from? And the answer is their innervation comes from the posterior rami of the mixed cervical spinal nerves C1, C2, and C3. Remember, C1, C2, and C3, those come off the spinal levels C1 and C2 rather than C1, C2, and C3. Remember, that's because the first cervical mixed spinal nerves come off at the top of the C1 spinal level. Right, so the meningeal innervation of the inferior posterior cranial fossa here, the primary nociceptive afferents that innervate those portions of the meninges, they will have their peripheral processes going into the posterior rami of the mixed cervical spinal nerves C1, C2, and C3. And you might now ask, how do they actually get in there? Well, they will go through mainly the foramen magnum, and then they will get into those posterior rami of C1, C2, and C3 on either side, and then, of course, into the mixed cervical spinal nerve, then into the dorsal root, and then they'll have their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia of the C1, C2, and C3 mixed cervical spinal nerves, and their central processes will then go into the substantia gelatinosa to synapse onto second-order neurons. Okay, so that then is my discussion of the innervation of the meninges. What I now need to talk to you about is the concept of referred pain from the meninges. And this is very much so to do with the trigeminocervical complex and convergence of primary nociceptive afferents onto secondary nociceptive afferents in the trigeminocervical complex. So, I think we'll stay in this position. So let me just write down the key terms here. So, referred pain. So, I've spelt that horribly wrong. Not a double F. Referred pain. So referred pain is the concept that you feel pain that is originating from one area of the body as originating from a different area of the body. So you've got nociceptors being activated in one area of the body, but the conscious sensation of pain is in a different area of the body. And the normal reason that you get referred pain is because of this concept of convergence of primary nociceptive afferents onto secondary nociceptive afferents, which means that the brain can't actually tell the difference. So let me explain this in a little bit more detail. So we have now discussed where the primary nociceptive afferents that innervate the meninges are going to get into the central nervous system. Their central processes will now be coming into the trigeminocervical complexes that we have discussed, because they're coming in either through the trigeminal nerve or they're coming in through the mixed cervical spinal nerves C1, C2, and C3, and therefore they're going to be coming in to either the trigeminal sensory nucleus or the substantia gelatinosa of the C1 and C2 spinal levels. They're then going to be synapsing onto second-order neurons, and the pathways are exactly the same as what we've previously discussed. If they are coming in the trigeminal nerve, they're going to be synapsing onto second-order neurons in the trigeminal sensory nucleus, and that second-order neuron will then throw its axon into the contralateral trigeminothalamic tract. If they're coming in the mixed cervical spinal nerves, C1, C2, and C3, they'll synapse onto a second-order neuron in the substantia gelatinosa of the C1 and C2 spinal levels, and the second-order neuron will throw its axon into the contralateral spinothalamic tract. So the pathways are exactly the same. Now, when we were discussing the spinothalamic tract and the trigeminothalamic tract and the trigeminocervical complex previously, I said that when we have that junction between primary nociceptive afferents and secondary nociceptive neurons, there is convergence, i.e., lots of primary nociceptive afferents synapse onto the same second-order neuron. So let me go over here. So here we've got a picture of a primary nociceptive afferent that could be innervating at the meninges. Okay, it's now going to synapse onto a second-order neuron that's going to have its cell body in the trigeminal cervical complex, and here is this picture of the second-order neuron. Here are its dendrites, and here is its axon. Now, it's got lots of dendrites, so other primary nociceptive afferents can also synapse onto the same second-order neuron. So let me just put one in here. So here's another central process of another primary nociceptive afferent synapsing onto that same second-order neuron. So this is the concept of convergence, that we have convergence of multiple primary nociceptive afferents onto the same second-order neuron. So there are far fewer second-order neurons in the trigeminal cervical complex than there are primary nociceptive afferents sending their central process into the trigeminocervical complex. Now, you might think, if you were designing the trigeminocervical complex, that when you have convergence, the way you would do it is that all of the primary nociceptive afferents that are going to synapse onto a single second-order neuron should be from the same portion of tissue. They should be innervating the same little bit of tissue. They should be very close to one another so that, they're giving information about the same sort of stimulus. However, that's not the way it actually works. Of the primary nociceptive afferents that are coming onto a certain second-order neuron, they can be coming from very different areas. And indeed, you might have it being the case that one of these primary nociceptive afferents that is coming onto this second-order neuron might be innervating, for instance, the frontalis muscle, to give a concrete example, and another primary nociceptive afferent that's innervating this second-order neuron might be coming from the meninges. And indeed, that's the way it works. So meningeal primary nociceptive afferents, they're going to end up synapsing onto often the same second-order neurons that are also being synapsed onto by primary nociceptive afferents from peripheral extracranial sites. And this is why the brain cannot actually usually tell the difference. You see, if that second order neuron was now activated, that would send a signal up to the brain, let's say, and that would give rise to the conscious sensation of pain. Where does the brain attribute that pain as coming from? Does it attribute it as coming from the site where this primary nociceptive afferent innervated, i.e. I said it was the frontalis muscle, or does it attribute it to coming from the meninges? And the answer is it attributes it to the one that's more likely. It's more used to experiencing pain from the extracranial sites, so it assumes that when this second order neuron has been activated and has sent a signal up to the third order neuron, which has then come up to the contralateral primary somatosensory cortex, has happened because of the activation of this peripheral primary nociceptive afferent rather than the meningeal one. That's why when you activate the meningeal nociceptors, it often the brain can't tell the difference and it attributes it to the peripheral place. So that's why pain is often referred from indeed visceral organs. It's not just the meninges. From a lot of the visceral organs of the body, it's attributed to peripheral processes because this happens at all the different levels of the body, that second order neurons in the substantia gelatinosa have a lot of primary nociceptive afferents coming onto them, and those primary nociceptive afferents aren't all from the same place. Some of them will be from peripheral sites and some of them will be from visceral sites, and the brain always interprets the pain as coming from the peripheral site usually rather than the visceral site, because it's more normal to have pain in the peripheral sites, because if you injure yourself, it's the peripheral sites that get injured and you're getting pain from those sites. So this is the basis for the referred pain of the meninges. So when you activate meningeal nociceptors, it often ends up being referred to the peripheral sites. Now, let me tell you about where the different areas of the meninges actually refer to, because this is now extremely significant. Those portions of the meninges that are innervated by branches from the ophthalmic nerve, i.e. the orbitofrontal meninges, the frontal meninges, the right top of the head, and the occipital meninges in the tentorium cerebelli, if you activate those primary nociceptive afferents, and of course their peripheral processes will come in through the ophthalmic divisions of the trigeminal nerves, their central processes will synapse onto second order neurons that are shared with primary nociceptive afferents that are also coming through generally the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. So the divisions generally, they stay with one another. So when you're looking at second order neurons that are being synapsed onto by, let's say, a primary nociceptive afferent that's coming in through the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, generally the other primary nociceptive afferents that are synapsing onto that one as well will also be coming in through the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve rather than a different division of the trigeminal nerve. So where is this pain going to refer to? It's going to refer to the peripheral sites of the ophthalmic nerve. And where are the peripheral sites of the ophthalmic nerve? The periorbital region and the frontal region. So usually if you activate the nociceptors in these orbitofrontal, frontal, occipital, or even the tentorium cerebelli meninges, the pain is felt in the ophthalmic areas, so in the ipsilateral ophthalmic area, of course. So the frontal region and the periorbital region. And that's really significant because if you activate the meninges in the occipital region, let's say on the left-hand side, I am now telling you that the pain you will experience won't be back here. It will most likely be in the left frontal and periorbital region because it's referred to the peripheral sites of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, let's continue on. Let's do the branches from the maxillary nerve and the mandibular nerve next. So the maxillary nerve, we know that it's got branches going to these anterior portion of the middle cranial fossa meninges. Again, its primary nociceptive afferents from the meninges, their central processes are going to synapse onto second order neurons that are also going to be synapsed onto by peripheral primary nociceptive afferents that are coming in through the maxillary nerve, and therefore its pain ends up being referred to the peripheral site as well. So its pain can end up being referred to the top portion of the cheek and also the anterior portion of the temporal region, because remember this region of the face, this is innervated by the zygomaticofacial and the zygomaticotemporal nerves, which are branches of the maxillary nerve. So this sort of region, again, tissue around the eye, which often does become painful in migraines. Okay, so if you activate the meningeal nociceptors in this region, this anterior region of the middle cranial fossa, I am now telling you that it will refer to the ipsilateral top portion of the cheek and this anterior portion of the peripheral temporal region. With regards to the mandibular nerve, we know that the posterior portion of the middle cranial fossa, its meninges are innervated by branches from the mandibular nerve, and again the same principle applies here. Those neurons, those primary nociceptive afferent central processes will be converging in the trigeminocervical complex, and the second order neurons that they're converging onto will also be receiving input from primary nociceptive afferents from peripheral places, most likely that are also coming in from the mandibular nerve. And indeed, if you activate meninges in the posterior portion of the middle cranial fossa, that often refers to the temporal region as well. Not usually the jaw, it's usually the temporal region, this sort of region of the temporal region, which is also innervated by branches from the mandibular nerve, the peripheral branches from the mandibular nerve. But it's not usually down in the jaw, it's usually this region, which is of course innervated by the auriculotemporal branch of the mandibular nerve. Finally, talking about the inferior posterior cranial fossa, of course, it's innervated by primary nociceptive afferents that are the central processes of which, that are going to come in through the posterior rami of the mixed cervical spinal nerves. So they're going to synapse onto second order neurons down in the substantia gelatinosa of the C1 and C2 levels, and those second order neurons are again going to have convergence, and they're also going to have primary nociceptive afferents from peripheral sites that are also going to be coming in through the posterior rami of the mixed cervical spinal nerve, and where mixed cervical spinal nerves rather, and where do the posterior rami of the cervical spinal nerves C1, C2, and C3 supply? It's the back of the head and the back of the neck region. So often if you activate the meningeal nociceptors in the inferior posterior cranial fossa region, then the pain ends up referring to the back of the head and the back of the neck region, because that's where peripheral primary nociceptive afferents whose peripheral processes are going to run in the posterior rami of C1, C2, and C3 innervate. Okay, right, so there is where activation of the different meningeal nociceptors in the different areas of the meninges is going to refer to, and I hope you sort of understand why that actually works, because of the convergence of the meningeal primary nociceptive afferents and peripheral nociceptive afferents in the trigeminocervical complex onto the same second order neurons. Right, the final thing that I want to say in this video is just to hint where we're going to go on to in the next video. We do need to now have a break. So where are we going to go in the next video? Well, I want to discuss specific parts of the tissues of the meninges that are actually going to be innervated by these meningeal nociceptors. So I've now discussed the branches from the divisions of the trigeminal nerves and the posterior rami of the mixed cervical spinal nerves that are actually going to innervate the meninges. The question is now, which parts of the meninges are they actually innervating? Now, of course, a lot of those nociceptors will just be innervating the connective tissue itself, the membranes itself. So, for instance, in the outer layers, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, you certainly do have nociceptors that are just present in those membranes and are innervating the meninges themselves. However, one of the key places where you find a lot of meningeal nociceptors is around arteries. So in the connective tissue that surrounds artery walls, you find a lot of meningeal nociceptors there. So we're now, in the next video, going to do more background anatomy. We're going to have a look at the arteries that are in the meninges, and there are two classes of arteries in the meninges. There are those that are in the outer layers of the meninges that actually supply the meninges themselves, and those are the meningeal blood vessels, and there are those that are in the subarachnoid space in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, and those are the cerebral blood vessels that are going to supply the brain. When you see a brain specimen and you see all the arteries on the surface of the brain specimen, those arteries would normally be in the subarachnoid space. They're on top of the pia mater, but below the arachnoid mater, bathed in the CSF. And those arteries, of course, they're also in the meninges because the subarachnoid space is part of the great cluster of meninges, and their peripheral connective tissue is innervated by meningeal nociceptors. So in the next video, I'm going to tell you about firstly meningeal arteries, the blood supply to the meninges themselves, because they're going to have innervation by meningeal nociceptors, and they're going to be in the outer layers of the meninges, and then we'll move on to discuss the cerebral artery supply, the arteries that are on the surface of the brain in the subarachnoid space, which are also going to be innervated by meningeal nociceptors from the nerves that we have now just discussed. Okay, so we'll have a break now, and in the next video we'll do that background anatomy of the arteries.